As I make this video at the beginning of 2021, we're at a very interesting point in human history. Now, I'm not talking about COVID or the recent US election results or anything like that. I think they'll actually pale in comparison. You see, for me, the most interesting point about the 2020s is that in all likelihood, we're about to watch the world's dominant superpower be replaced by another superpower. And as a history teacher, this is not only really fascinating, but it's also really concerning. Not because I'm anti-China and actually consider myself a little bit more pro-China than most in my country, Australia, but I'm concerned because usually dominant empires don't change hands easily. Rome didn't just say, hey, let's stop being the dominant world power in Europe, in North Africa, in Asia Minor. It actually fought against Germanic raiders until they lost. And so for many of us watching this video, we may actually be faced with the decision of do we enlist to fight in this future war that takes place between the two superpowers. So it's for this reason that I legitimately think that modern China is more important to study than anything else in modern history. As with World War I, when so many really had no idea why they were fighting, it'd be a tragedy for a generation to not really know why they're going into this potential upcoming war between China and the USA and all their allies. And so in this series, we are going to look at the rise of China from 1945 up until the present day with Xi Jinping. How did they go from being plebs to now toppling the USA? And to do that, we're going to begin with these two guys here. Okay, hopefully I didn't scare you off with that doomsday intro. Modern China is actually really fascinating to study. Now, when I talk about modern China, most people would begin in 1912 when the dynastic empire style of government ended. But I'm going to fast forward to 1945 because that's when the current Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, really started to make some waves. So, if you don't know your history, 1945 is a pretty significant year. It was the year that Hitler took his own life in his bunker in Berlin, and it was the year that the USA dropped their atomic bombs on Japan. Essentially, the year World War II ended. Now, during World War II, China didn't have a clear leader. Most of the country was controlled by the leader of the Nationalist Party, otherwise known as the KMT or Kuomintang, a guy called Chiang Kai-Shek, and that's this guy here. Now, some of the country was occupied by Japan, but other parts of the country, aka the northeast of China, were controlled by the communist leader, otherwise known as the CCP, Mao Zedong. Now, up until Japan arrived, Mao and Chiang were at war with each other, but then when Japan launched their invasion, they made a reluctant alliance to cooperate, at least until Japan was dealt with. And so after Japan surrendered following the bombs, China was left with a massive question. Who was going to rule China? Chiang or Mao? And the world was well aware that China was facing this question, so the USA got in first and asked Mao and Chiang to join them for a meeting to talk things out in the city of Chongqing in 1945. Chiang happily joined the meeting because the US had been his strong ally during World War II in fighting off the Japanese, and he knew that America wouldn't favour a communist government. Although he didn't know the details, he knew that America was gearing up for the Cold War against Stalin's communist Soviet Union, and he knew that America was never going to allow a communist country just to pop up next to Stalin. And so for the exact same reason, Mao Zedong was really reluctant to join. He felt that he wouldn't get a fair deal for the communists because of the USA's disdain for communism, but he also knew that not attending would be a terrible look for the communists, so he decided to go. However, what he did was he made US diplomat Patrick Hurley join him on his flight to Chongqing because he was so paranoid that America would shoot down his plane. And so in the discussions at Chongqing, very little progress was made. The USA didn't favour Chiang as much as he hoped for. Yes, President Truman was very concerned of Soviet communism, but the emphasis was more on the Soviet part than the communist part.
Soviet Union?
He was worried that a weak and divided China would be easily controlled by Stalin. Even if China was communist, if it wasn't controlled by Stalin, then that would be a win in Truman's eyes. So at Chongqing, basically nothing got done. There was a loose agreement to meet again in the future and have something of a combined coalition government, but neither Chiang nor Mao were really that keen on living up to the deal, and both still wanted China under their control. So a few minor battles broke out between the two forces in late 1945. Now, Truman was really concerned, and so he appointed war hero George Marshall to go into China and to sort this all out.
And the more resolute at the front?
Now, Marshall urged Chiang Kai-Shek to not attack any of Mao's strongholds in the northeast, and he threatened withholding US aid. Chiang basically ignored this and launched an attack against Mukden and Changchun in the spring of 1946. And so as Chiang's KMT forces attacked Mukden and Changchun, it was really only going to be a one-way battle. The KMT army at this point outnumbered the communists 5-1. Just think about that. For every one communist soldier, they were surrounded by 5 nationalist soldiers. But it wasn't just that. Materially, the KMT was way better resourced. You see, the US had helped arm China during World War II, and they gave Chiang's nationalists access to all sorts of valuable naval and aerial ships. The nationalists had a completely operational army, navy, and air force. Now, on the other hand, the communists had spent most of World War II doing guerrilla warfare and fighting the Japanese in the streets. And so as the KMT rolled into Mukden and Changchun in the north, Mao's forces really stood no chance. And so if you were an onlooker in 1946, there seemed to be almost no question that Chiang would go on to win this civil war. He had the numbers, he had the resources, and at the end of the day, he had more US support than Mao had. And so if history followed the playbook on this one, our world would be very different. Sure, China would have been far from democratic. Make no mistake, Chiang Kai-Shek was not big on democracy. But there would be nowhere near the strain on relations with the USA that was to come. At the end of the day, Chiang would have owed his success to America, and China would not have become their opponent to the same extent that they later would. But this one did not follow the history playbook at all. From seemingly an unlosable position, Chiang's house of cards was about to come crashing down. Little did Chiang know, but one of Mao's spies had infiltrated his military at the highest level and was eating them alive from the inside. Not only that, but somebody else decided they didn't want good old Chiang taking over China. Enter Joseph Stalin. Stay tuned for part 2, where we look at the unbelievable turnaround in this war and how Mao would go on to take over all of China. Make sure to subscribe and hit notifications so you don't miss out, and we'll see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.